What's up guys, Lon here from Android Authority, and today we're taking a look at the Moto G7 and the Moto G7 Power. These are two out of the 4 smartphones that Motorola released in the G7 lineup, and if you couldn't tell by the name, these are the 7th generation Moto Gs, and Motorola has had a lot of success with the Moto G line. The very first Moto G became their most popular smartphone, and they've continued to have success with it ever since, and for one very good reason. The price was always super affordable, and for that price, you got a pretty reasonable package in terms of specifications, performance, and features, and they're looking to continue that same approach with the G7 and G7 Power. So the Moto G7 costs $299, and the Moto G7 Power costs $249. And for the most part, they're fairly similar, but there are some differences that separate them. The G7 is the more powerful of the two. This is sort of the flagship, if you will, out of the G7 lineup. And the G7 Power, despite the word power being in the name, is actually a little bit lower spec. The power is actually referring to the large 5,000 milliamp hour battery that's in this thing, which is pretty huge and quite a bit bigger than the 3,000 milliamp hour battery that's in the Moto G7. They do, however, have the same Snapdragon processor, but the Moto G7 does have 1 extra gigabyte of RAM and doubles the internal storage. So you're gonna get slightly better performance on the Moto G7 in terms of multitasking and things like that. But for the most part, they both felt very similar in terms of performance. You're gonna be able to run apps, play games, browse the web, check social media, or watch YouTube perfectly fine. And you can even play games on these phones without really that much of an issue. So I had no complaints at all using these phones as a daily driver when it came to performance. Now for sub $300 smartphones, the Moto G7 and G7 Power look and feel a lot nicer than their price tags would lead you to believe. They also have really big displays on the front. They actually have the same size display and the same LCD technology. The only difference here is the resolution. The Moto G7 has a full HD Plus display, and the G7 Power has an HD Plus display. So the G7 Plus display is noticeably sharper. The icons and the text just look a lot crisper, whereas on the G7 Power, everything looks a little bit more jagged. The other difference between these two displays is the notches. They both have notches, but the G7 has a water drop style notch, whereas the G7 Power has the more traditional wider notch. So the water drop notch not only looks a little bit nicer, but you're also getting slightly more screen real estate. The rest of the hardware is pretty much identical. They both have micro SD card slots for extra storage. They both have rear-facing fingerprint sensors. They both have single speakers, and they both have a headphone jack. The only difference is the G7 has its headphone jack on the bottom, and the G7 Power has its headphone jack on the top. Of course, with these phones being sub $300 smartphones, there are some sacrifices that have to be made in order to meet that price point. You're not gonna find a ton of bells and whistles like you would on a phone that has a $1,000 price tag. So the Moto G7 and G7 Power don't have wireless charging. They also don't have NFC, which means you can't take advantage of Google Pay or Android Beam. And they also are not IP certified. That means there's no official water resistance. They do, however, have a protective nano coating that Motorola tends to put on a lot of their phones, so it can survive a splash or getting caught out in the rain, but I don't recommend dunking these in the pool or in the toilet. I would say one of the biggest bright spots for the G7 and G7 Power is definitely the battery life, especially in the case of the G7 Power. That 5,000 milliamp hour battery in combination with the low resolution display is a perfect recipe for long-lasting battery life, and Motorola claims that this phone can last up to 3 days. I haven't exactly gotten 3 days, but I am getting a full solid 2 days on a single charge with a ridiculous amount of screen on time. And the G7's battery life isn't bad either. I'm still getting 5 to 6 hours of screen on time, which isn't gonna get you 2 or 3 days worth of battery life, but it will get you a full solid day. Now the cameras on these two phones aren't amazing. They're definitely not gonna stack up to smartphones that are 3 or 4 times its price, but they're decent for what it's worth. They both have 12 megapixel sensors, but they're not identical sensors. The G7 has an aperture of f1.8 and the G7 Power has an aperture of f2.0. And the Moto G7 also has an extra 5 megapixel depth sensor, so your portrait mode photos are going to look a little bit better. And the G7 is capable of taking a portrait mode photo of anything, whereas the G7 Power can only take a portrait mode photo when it detects a face. In low light conditions, these cameras are not that great. They're pretty terrible, to be honest, but if you're in bright conditions, these cameras can actually grab some pretty nice looking photos. I will say that the G7 is a little bit better at image processing. The photos are a little bit brighter and the colors are also a little bit more vibrant. I also prefer the warmer look of the G7, whereas the G7 Power tends to have more of a bluish tint to it, which I don't think looks quite as attractive. My absolute favorite thing about the Moto G7 and the G7 Power, or any Motorola phone really, is the software experience, because Motorola is very good at keeping the software very close to stock. So you essentially have a stock build of Android 9 Pie, but with these being Motorola phones, you of course get Motorola's entire suite of software features, all of their gesture controls like the double chop to turn on the flashlight, the wrist twist to launch the camera, and of course you also have things like Moto Display for seeing your notifications, and there are a few things that I actually think Motorola handles better than stock Android Pie. Motorola's gesture navigation controls are much more intuitive and they feel a little bit more like the iPhones, and you can actually do a short swipe up to open the app drawer on the G7 and G7 Power instead of that long swipe up that you have to do on stock Android Pie. So that's pretty much it for this review of the Moto G7 and G7 Power. Overall, I think Motorola continues to strike a really perfect balance between price, performance, features, without a whole lot of sacrifices and compromise. And these phones are really solid if you just want something that has a lot of modern features, a lot of modern design elements, without spending a ton of cash. But if you need a lot of extra bells and whistles, you need IP certification, you need wireless charging, you're better off looking at more expensive alternatives. But for how much these phones cost and everything that they're capable of, these are extremely solid options, and I would have no problems recommending them to people that just want a phone that isn't going to cost them a ton of money. But that's it. Thanks for watching this review of the Moto G7 and G7 Power. Let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And as always, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe down below if you haven't already. And I will talk to you guys in the next video.